The United States is the richest and most powerful country in history, but its rise to number one was actually quite unexpected. For more than a century after it was discovered, most of North America was ignored by early European explorers. It lacked the spices and the gold they were hunting for. Instead, Spain and Portugal drew a line right down the middle of the map. They agreed that the resource-rich regions of South America and Asia would belong to them, essentially dismissing the northern continent as useless land. The English eventually arrived, but they waited nearly 100 years after their first explorations to start colonizing in earnest. By 1754, their expanding colonies collided with French territory, triggering 7 years of frontier warfare between the two empires and their Indian allies. The British won the war and secured the land, but the victory left them with a staggering debt. To pay for the expensive conflict, they began collecting heavy taxes from the American colonists for the first time. The colonists refused to pay taxes to a government where they held no vote. This disagreement turned into a revolution, and on July 4, 1776, the Americans declared their independence from Great Britain. Winning the war was only the beginning. The new nation was failing fast, because the 13 colonies acted as 13 independent countries, united only in name. Without a strong central authority, the fragile republic began to collapse under its own weight. To save the country, the Founding Fathers pivoted, drafting an entirely new constitution and creating a federal government with the power to actually govern. This legal framework bound the states together. By 1789, the document was ratified, and George Washington was elected the first president. Even with a functional government, the experiment was physically small. Geographically trapped between the Atlantic Ocean and the vast territories owned by Spain, the new nation remained a minor player on the world stage, desperate for room to expand. To grow, the U.S. needed to send goods down the Mississippi River, but the river and the vital port of New Orleans belonged to France. If Napoleon Bonaparte controlled that waterway, he controlled the American economy. The Americans asked to buy just the city of New Orleans, but Napoleon was preparing to invade Britain and needed to fund his war effort. He feared that if he didn't sell the land, the Americans might support the British. Napoleon offered the entire territory for $15 million. For under 3 cents an acre, the U.S. acquired the heart of the continent. This deal instantly doubled the country's size, providing vast lands just as the population skyrocketed. With the average American family having 7 children, the population was doubling every 20 years. This surge of people pushed west, occupying indigenous hunting grounds and moving into the sparsely populated northern territories of Mexico. When Texas settlers broke away from Mexico, their eventual annexation by the U.S. sparked a war. By the end of that conflict, the United States had paid $15 million to take Mexico's northern territories, finally reaching the Pacific Ocean. 5 years later, the discovery of gold in California brought a flood of human capital and wealth to the West. At the same time, a deal with Britain secured the Oregon Territory, completing a coast-to-coast empire in just 50 years. This rapid sprint transformed the U.S. into a continental power, but it also forced a debate that would nearly destroy the country. The flaw in this expansion was slavery. As new states were added, the North and South argued bitterly over whether the practice would be allowed in the new territories. In the North, it was seen as an evil. In the South, it was the backbone of the economy. The tension reached a head in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln. Believing he would abolish slavery, most of the slave states separated to form their own country. The resulting Civil War forced the country to mobilize its entire industrial strength. Years of fighting cost hundreds of thousands of lives, but the North's victory ensured the slaves were freed and the states were reunited. Surviving this internal collapse fundamentally changed the nation. It emerged from the war as a unified, industrialized power with a battle-hardened military and a centralized economy. By 1865, the United States was no longer a collection of independent states. It was a single, cohesive engine of production, ready to project its influence far beyond its own borders. The U.S. immediately looked for offshore bases. They even passed a law allowing citizens to claim any uninhabited island covered in bird guano for fertilizer, a move that quietly extended American soil across the Pacific. In 1867, Secretary of State William Seward saw another opportunity. The Russian Tsar was struggling and wanted to sell Alaska. Seward negotiated the purchase for just over $7 million. This purchase added 586,000 square miles of territory to the U.S. at a time when the country was rapidly becoming an industrial giant, hungry for the resources found in the northern wilderness. Next came Hawaii. American businessmen took control of the islands, and despite initial hesitation from Washington, the U.S. annexed them to ensure no other power could use them as a naval base to attack the American coast. By 1898, public sympathy for Cuban revolutionaries and a mysterious explosion on the warship Maine pushed the U.S. into a war with Spain. It was the first true test of America's new global reach. The U.S. quickly dismantled the remains of the Spanish Empire, capturing Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. In just a few months, the United States had transformed into an overseas empire. Theodore Roosevelt, the energetic new president, understood that a global empire needed a global navy. He built up the second-largest fleet in the world and sought a way to move it quickly between the Atlantic and Pacific. The completion of the Panama Canal in 1914 was a feat of engineering that reshaped global trade. By controlling this short pit, the U.S. could now dominate shipping lanes and move its powerful navy from one ocean to the other in days rather than months. America's rise was never a preordained destiny. It was a 400-year chain reaction of lucky geography, cheap land deals, and an industrial engine forged in the fire of a civil war. By the time World War I began, the United States was no longer an ignored continent. It was the wealthiest and most powerful nation.